Hello, my name's Karen Hustler and I'm the Assistant Director of Fellowship and Awards at Advanced HE. When you're putting together your accreditation submission, it's probably really important to know how this is going to be reviewed at our end at Advanced HE. And the first thing to say that it isn't us that's doing the review process, but we are facilitating it. So we've appointed a series of experts from across the sector, all with wide-ranging responsibilities in an institution at the moment, or with recent experience of having had wide-ranging responsibilities. And 3 of these peer reviewers, called accreditors, will each look at your submission. When you're thinking about your writing, you have the submission template, which you'll be populating, and you'll have all of your participant-facing documentation as we set out in our guidance that we ask you to submit. Think about the reader. So using a font size that's quite accessible is a good idea. Making sure you have simple things like page numbers and that you've named all your documents appropriately so that we don't have 2 Appendix 1, for example, which could be confusing during a meeting. Each of our peer reviewers will receive your submission at least 3 weeks before we meet face-to-face for a panel meeting at our York offices. I chair Accreditation Panels, as does my colleague, the Head of Fellowships, and on a busy day we will have 2 panels running here in York. In my panel there'll be 3 peer reviewers who have each looked at the submission in detail before the meeting. They will have compiled all their individual feedback without knowing what their other peer reviewers think. They fill in a form which sets out against each of the criteria in turn, all 16 subpoints, where they think there are strengths and where they think there are either policy requirements not being met or whether the information we ask for in the guidance isn't clear or perhaps doesn't reflect the descriptor that's being applied for accurately. What we do then in the meeting is we will go through each institution is led by one of the peer reviewers and they're allocated in advance when they've done their individual feedback, and they will talk through criteria by criteria your submission. When they're reading the submission, they'll read Part C of the template first, and that's the bit around the institutional commitment. But then after that, they'll generally look at all your participant-facing guidance next. So when you're thinking about putting your information together, a real focus on the participant-facing side is important. When they've read that, they'll also then read the part of the template that concerns that programme about the infrastructure behind it. We work our way through all of your submission, programme by programme and scheme, following each of the 16 subpoints of the criteria. The reviewers will try and find the information rather than find it's not there. So we often spend time in meetings where somebody says, I'm sure I've seen this information somewhere, and then we all look to see if we can find it and agree with that. However, pointing them directly to the information is really helpful. So any signposting you can do in the template is helpful to show where they'll find that information in the programme guidance. As we go through the panel, we'd love to find that there are no conditions to set because you followed our policy and guidance really thoroughly and therefore all our requirements are met. And in that circumstance, you'll just get a letter of commendation for all the strengths they found and will be awarding accreditation straight away. Far more common than that, however, is when you've got 3 experts from the sector. They'll find things potentially in your programmes and schemes that might help it to operate better, or they might find areas where actually you haven't met our requirements, and then they'll set conditions. What you'll get after the panel is a letter from us as a letter of commendation with the strengths in and telling you about the outcome. Please spend time reading that because sometimes people don't realise what strengths there are. And of course you can use the quotes from that letter in all sorts of externally facing submissions you might be making on other fronts, such as TEF submissions or whatever. But then you'll go to the action plan. The action plan will set out the conditions that you have to meet before we will award accreditation, and you have a month to revise information and submit a revised submission. You'll also have some panel recommendations, and these are things you don't have to do, but that actually might be helpful to consider. And institutions have reported to us they often find these things really helpful. My job as chair, and also another member of the team, a fellowship and awards advisor, will be there firstly to make sure that people stay on policy and don't deviate onto the things that they like or don't like or think should be there. We see all sorts of different programmes, and it's not our job to judge whether or not we would want to go on to the programme ourselves. That's up to you and your context and what's been designed to suit your institution. However, we are there to make sure that all policy requirements have been met. So we chair the meeting and take notes at the meeting, and then after the meeting we will then generate the action plan. If you have actions to meet, you have a month to meet them. It will then go back to the same panel of reviewers and they will look at your revised information. So please highlight any changes you make and point them to those changes in the action plan you have. They then have another 3 weeks to check that the information you've provided has met conditions, and then we award accreditation. The last outcome that we really don't want to reach is a return for further development. And this only happens when we apply all of the accreditation criteria and find that actually substantial change is needed to meet those criteria. In this instance, you'll have advice back from the panel about the major areas that need further development before you can submit again. And you would have one further chance then to make a submission without a fee, and that would go to a completely new panel, and they will make an unbiased judgment on whether or not your new submission, which they'll see from scratch, meets requirements or not. And hopefully in that instance you'd have a successful outcome on the second go. You do have a chance for a developmental review by one of our UKPSF expert consultants, and that's part of your membership entitlement with Advance HE. We would want you to contact our team and arrange for that consultancy. I would advise that sometime close to submission, about 4 to 6 weeks before you plan to submit, when your final draft documents are ready, is the best time to have that consultancy. We would ask that you give the consultant all the documentation a week before the visit or a week before you meet online to discuss it. If you're based outside of the UK, we might be doing this remotely. The consultant will then review everything and then spend a day with your team or the allotted time online, depending which is the best for you. And they'll go through all the areas that they've identified as strengths, but particularly pick out all the points that they think you should consider and develop further before you submit. All of this should help you put in the best possible submission so that you'll have programmes and schemes that meet your priorities but also meet our requirements.